Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Trust Issues, a podcast from Kepler Trust Intelligence. Before I introduce this week's guest, your reminder that nothing we say should be construed as investment advice. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future results. The value of investments can fall as well as rise, and you may get back less than you invested when you decide to sell your investments. It is strongly recommended that independent financial advice should be taken before entering into any financial transaction. And with that, I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Trust Issues from Kepler Trust Intelligence. This week, I'm joined by Izabella Kaminska. I think a lot of people listening will probably be familiar with Izabella because she was the editor of FT Alphaville, which I think for many people was and maybe still is one of the best bits of the FT website or publication. She left. Actually, when did you leave? Like a year ago?
Yeah, about a year ago, exactly.
And to set up the Blindspot, which is a sort of Alphaville-esque type
Challenger.
Yeah, as an Alphaville challenger. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend having a look. And we'll just be running through, I suppose, things that have happened over the past 12 months and what we think is going to happen in the 12 months ahead. So maybe in true journalist fashion, we can begin. I think next week is Davos. Is anything interesting going to happen at Davos?
Well, chances are no. The history of Davos suggests that they're usually incredibly behind the curve, and rather than being visionaries, they're sort of reactionaries who are tackling topics that were really front and center of the world 2 years ago, right? So I think it's very much the same. What's interesting about Davos this year is that they have usually you can get all the schedules and the events, you can access them online, but they've closed their whole platform off, and they're now offering subscriptions. So if you want to even know what the agenda is, you have to subscribe to them. You have to pay them like 30 euros a month or whatever. So everyone's doing the blue tick thing, which I think is very interesting. So Elon is making everyone pay for their blue tick status, and now Davos and WEF are emulating him by creating an extra layer in the hierarchy, because obviously one of the big things at Davos is the internal badge hierarchy. If you've got a white badge, you're like top of the pyramid, and then it goes further down and down through the colors. But now we have this new virtual status, and they've got 3 packages. You've got the free one, which gets you absolutely nothing, the 30 euros a month, and then like an even more expensive one that gets you the opportunity to watch the conferences from the comfort of your armchair. So I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think even prior to probably the pandemic, there was a general sense that the Davos man, which is, I suppose, for listeners not familiar with the term, is sort of like a international sort of elite type figure who, in the minds of conspiracy theorists, probably controls the world and things like that. But I would say it's more like a sort of technocratic elite type person, right? So if you look at, I think that's probably the main criticism of something like the European Union, is that it's basically a very centralized technocratic organization, and I think that's probably what most, aside from the more conspiratorial-minded people, critics of something like Davos or World Economic Forum would probably say it's a similar sort of thing, where you have a kind of small group of technocrats who are trying to rule by fiat, or whatever you want to call that. I think that probably the extent to which that seemed like it was a thing some people were not happy with even prior to the pandemic. It seems like that's even more the case now, maybe because the pandemic showed that people aren't really in control. There's like a lack of control from government, and then with the invasion of Ukraine, you just have this complete breakdown of sort of the international system. So do you think that those sorts of things will hold less, if they held anyway? I mean, you could argue they're not really doing anything, but do you think those sorts of organizations will hold less weight moving forward?
So I think what's happened is really unfortunate, because we've got the evolution of this mad conspiracy about Klaus Schwab sort of secretly trying to take over the world. And in a way, that is really doing everyone who is concerned about the forum's influence a disservice, because it makes legitimate criticism of the forum harder, because you then get bucketed in the conspiracy camp, right?
Yeah.
And there are legitimate criticisms to be made of the forum. And I mean, the hypocrisies alone of, like, gathering all these billionaires in their private jets, the whole mantra of what Klaus Schwab is trying to achieve there is a sort of stakeholder capitalist system that allows for all voices to be heard. I mean, I've likened it to like a massive consensus machine, like a blockchain. It's like a human blockchain, where everyone has to compromise to create some sort of consensus. And Klaus, and this is what the conspiracy theorists don't appreciate, is that Klaus in many ways is quite anti-woke, because he accepts everyone. He wants everyone to be in the forum, and he has platformed everyone from Vladimir Putin to Xi Jinping to Donald Trump, Bolsonaro. Everyone is invited to the forum, because Klaus is a real believer in this idea that if you don't have the wingnuts at the table, then you can't create a consensus. So he is, in a weird way, like more anti-woke in the platforming sense than anybody. I mean, WEF is like a Twitter for the elite, right? But in human form. And I think that is often very much overlooked. But of course, the ultimate hypocrisy of WEF is that it preaches all this transparency, this idea of like ethical capitalism, and putting more than just pure profit in at the front and center of your commercial operation. But in reality, on the transparency front, in practice, WEF has loads of little secretive panels and meetings. It's a place where you have open sessions, but you also have a lot of private sessions. And those are seen as essential, because you can't speak pragmatically about all sorts of things unless it is private. So the reality of life and the way diplomacy works is you have to have private sessions. So then it ends up being hypocritical. And then in terms of the kind of profit, putting profits last, Davos itself has to be commercially viable, and who knows how many conflicts of interests are going on as a result of those very close-knit conversations, because there is no transparency in terms of, like, nobody has to say what their private investments are. Klaus doesn't reveal how he invests his own private wealth. We don't know that. There's no he's not like Nancy, at least Nancy Pelosi, when she front runs her decisions and what's going on in Congress, she has to at least declare her financial position, right? Klaus doesn't have to do that. We don't have a clue how he's using that information. So those are the hypocrisies around. But also, I think fundamentally, it's just very dull. I've got the because obviously now you can't get the agenda. But by the time this goes to air, it's probably already been. But I've had someone leak to me the agenda. I mean, you're looking at sessions that are like, in defense of Europe, fine, okay, but not exactly interesting. That's going to be a session with, amongst others, Andrzej Duda, so the president of Poland, mastering new energy economics, philanthropy, a catalyst for protecting our planet. Quiet quitting and the meaning of work. I mean, that was a story 2 years ago, or even a year ago. So it's always, I think, on the catching up front rather than moving ahead. I haven't seen any one of these panels that is really kind of like made me think, oh, I didn't think about that. But it is.
So largely it's basically a kind of waste of time. Maybe the next topic. I mean, one of the panels you mentioned there was on energy, right? And I think readers of your site, maybe even prior to you setting up the website, were basically very pessimistic about what was going to happen in Europe because of the energy markets, and especially in the UK and Germany. And that didn't really pan out. So I mean, can you talk about why you think that didn't happen, and also whether maybe there's still time for you to be right in the coming year?
Yeah, so mea culpa, because definitely I was on the kind of it's going to be disaster this winter side of things. Although I was very critical of the other. In some quarters there was this idea that Europe would fall apart and it would be chaos and revolution. I always pulled back against that, because even if we had blackouts and energy scarcity, my view on Europe is that in the end, Europeans would come together and we would not go like totally, crazy, because I think lockdown showed how much of a sense of togetherness we have, and European populations always surprise me in terms of their resilience and coherence when it comes to sort of abiding by government sort of recommendations. So I wasn't of the opinion that everything was going to kind of go into what's the phrase? Helena
Handbasket.
That's it. Helena Handbasket. But I was wrong in terms of the blackout. So we've obviously managed to sail through the winter so far. Some people, I mean, realistically, the pressure point was always going to be January, but it now looks like we're going to be fine. Now, a lot of that has to do with the unexpectedly warm weather we've had in Europe. Had we had an average winter, it would have been challenging enough. If we had had a very cold winter, blackouts would have been guaranteed, in my opinion. Yeah. But we've had this exceptionally warm winter, and the joke, I've been pushing around, it's a joke, I don't believe it, but it is funny. It's almost like NATO put on a weather machine to help itself, right? Yeah. So it's been incredibly useful. And also, we never anticipated how quickly the Germans would react. They've built this LNG terminal almost overnight. It shows what you can do if you take bureaucracy out of the conversation. So that is very encouraging. It's like with the vaccines or with lockdown, Project Warp Speed. If we really need to do something and we take out the bureaucracy, amazing things can happen. So those were the things I didn't anticipate. That said, we still have to consider the fact that most of last year we were still having pipelined gas. And we have now moved almost entirely into imported LNG. And whatever happens, the base cost of that is going to be higher than pipeline gas, simply because the actual logistics of bringing over gas in LNG form are always going to be more expensive than pipelined gas. So the base cost is going to normalize around a higher level. So at the moment, prices have really overreacted. They've now almost they've completely now gone to the other extreme. But they're likely to go back up and settle around some sort of, 10%, 20% higher than what would have been the norm. Yeah. And that is going to feed through into inflation eventually. Probably, bar all the lockdown stuff and all the other stuff, it would have been a good thing to some degree. But we need to watch inflation. I think it's not necessarily, this year is going to be the challenge, because we're going to have 100% dependency on LNG. If there's a cold winter anywhere, there's going to be competition from the rest of the world for that LNG. And we've got other constraints as well coming our way if and when tensions with China increase. If we have, at the moment, a lot of the substitution has been going into renewables. Renewables are, when it comes to solar, entirely exclusively, almost all our solar comes from China. So if there's any tensions on that front, that's going to be increasingly hard to manage. So that's my overview. I think overall, the cost of sort of bailing out Bulb in the UK has turned out to be lower than expected. But this again is because because of the correction in the prices and in the wholesale prices. We're now pushing through this $60 barrel price cap. We'll see how that, whether the market responds to that. At the moment, it's going to be okay because the forces are with us. It'll be tested if there is any shortages. So if there's a hurricane next September, or there's any kind of other geopolitical upset, say in the Middle East, that's when things might get increasingly tight.
Okay. Well, I mean, you touched on a couple of interesting points there. So one is inflation. I mean, I think there's other factors beyond the sort of energy shock that we had last year that are driving it. Do you think that the central bank, I mean, say in the UK and the US, will be able to keep a lid on it this year, or do you think it's going to be a sort of 1970s type scenario where it lasts for quite a,
So I think
five years or something?
in the short term, I think we're going to have a correction. So I think we will have plateaued for the rest. I do think the interest rate hikes we've had so far they're going to ease up on those because the economy is obviously responding to that. That said, the long-term trend, I think, is still inflationary. I don't think we're going to get into the sort of core deflationary world that we were in post-2008, not least because of like the Inflation Reduction Act, ironically called, and all the investment that we are pushing into renewables. The cost of the transition alone and the reality of greenflation is a thing. Like, that is a thing. If we end up having any more sort of I interviewed Niro Rubini a few months ago, and I agree with him. Like, there are multiple wars we are facing, and war is inflationary by definition, whether it's the war on climate change, whether it's the war against Russia, whether it's a potential trade war with China. All these things move us into an inflationary norm. And so I agree with him that even if we have a temporary sort of reduction, it's going to go, the days of like negative yields, I think, are going to be gone. And you see that now because the ECB is finally moving ahead with interest rates. And you've got the BOJ, obviously, that was the big one in the last month, changing its framework. So those forces, I think, are now out of the bag, and it'll be hard to put them back in. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think a little bit of inflation, if it's controlled, is entirely what we need to restructure the economy and make it focus on productivity again. Because one of the problems is that the zero negative rate world spawned all these, like,
tumor kind of
the
business.
vulgar term, like bullshit companies that are doing God knows what. From crypto, FTX, all that sort of stuff that emerged from the Ponzi, bubble inducing rate environment. So I think normalizing around 3 or 4% is really good for the economy. It will probably end up helping us really focus on productive innovation and a transfer away from a service economy more to a capital intensive one, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I think Russell Napier has said something similar like that a couple of months ago. But one of the points you touched on there was sort of basically bullshit companies. And I think if you look over the past decade, there's been, in the grand scheme of things, 10, 12 years is actually quite a long period of time, and to some extent. And so you have quite a lot of companies that started there. And so something like, the one I dislike the most is like Uber, really, just because it's made to be seen like this amazing thing, but actually, and I don't want to take away from, it being the product they made and so on, but it's just like, this is just a unprofitable company that subsidizes your taxi trips and made it a bit more convenient, but even now it doesn't seem like that much more convenient. But so this week I kind of thought that all of this stuff was done, right? Like the excesses of the past couple of years, where you just had so many companies coming to market, whether it's like IPO, SPAC, direct listing, with like just massively inflated valuation, no earnings, difficult to see how they would even get to being profitable, was done. But then so this GPT was called, whatever it's called, came out. And so I should caveat what I'm about to say by saying I think it's still really amazing. I think this is a really interesting product, or chat bot, or search engine, whatever you want to call it. And it is pretty amazing that someone has been able to create this thing. But when then you hear that the company is valued at 29 billion, even though I think that they haven't said how much they make in revenue. Like, I think the company that owns it is called OpenAI. From press reports, it says like low tens of millions. So I actually wrote something this week saying if you were generous and said low tens of millions would be 60 million, which doesn't really make sense. But if you were being generous and said 60 million, that would be like 500 times revenue valuation. And then loads of insiders are selling shares, right? So if people are doing that, it's generally not a sign that you have great faith in the ability of the company to make money going, or like you think that its valuation is justified. So I mean, I don't know if you think that sort of thing. First, I suppose there's two questions. One is like, do you think that sort of thing is done? Like we're finished with that kind of thing, and it was really just a phenomenon of the past like 10, 15 years where you just had really low rates that allowed people to pursue rubbish ideas, basically, that sounded cool. And then at the same time, this is kind of a controversial one, right? Because maybe this is an amazing new thing that is going to massively change the world. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the AI type thing, which is like,
I do. So I think one of the key points is that when funding and capital is cheap, you don't have to prioritize your investments in goods and services that are needed today, right? So when capital is tight and you have to pay a high interest rate for it, you're gonna want a return, right? So you have to focus on productive ventures that are going to generate profits and revenues very quickly, because you don't want to be paying over the roof for the capital loan for a long time. So that is the fundamental difference, right? So when interest rates are high, the economy is basically sending a signal: we need to invest in companies and services that are going to sort out our shortages, sort out all the problems that we have today. People need these goods; they're going to pay for them. There's no risk here. You will get your money back, and you only invest in the stuff that you know will be profitable. When rates are zero, it all becomes belief focused, right? Because you're basically, capital is cheap, so you've got a lot of time essentially before you have to really worry about paying it all back. And there's a luxury in terms of like where you put your money, and you can throw it about in all sorts of crazy things. And you do the whole VC thing, like a gambling thing, or well, one of these crazy things will definitely pay off, and I'll do that. And that's where I think we're coming out of that world. But I think when it comes to something like GPT, there is a contingent that sees that as a necessary, like, we must invest in this, otherwise we are not going to reach the escape velocity we need to transition into, whatever the singularities. There's a lot of that thinking in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
So even if interest rates are higher, they're prepared to blow it all on this I think it's called generative AI, right?
Yeah.
Because they see it as the means. If you've got it, then you can then use that and quantum computing and all the other stuff to create God knows what, all the new materials. That one of the things they think they'll be able to do is create new kind of atomic structures, or I'm not a scientist, molecular structures, I guess. Or, with ChatGPT, that will be the basis for an AI that can, sort all sorts of complex problems that we can't currently solve ourselves. So that's why it's getting the money, in my opinion. That said, it's a real leap. It's a real leap in faith, because whether it delivers, I mean, at the moment, ChatGPT, what we do know, I asked it yesterday to write me how much energy it uses, and it's incredibly energy intensive, right? It's not quite like cryptocurrency yet, but as it gets more and more sophisticated, the amount of server energy it's going to take up is going to end up competing with crypto, and then probably exponentially overdo it. So I think and based on the deal so I think Microsoft has recently, Semaphore was reporting the other day that Microsoft is looking to invest 10 billion in it, but it's a very interesting structure. Be part of a complicated deal in which the company would get 75% of OpenAI's profits until it recoups its investment. After
Yeah.
that threshold is reached, it would revert to a structure that reflects ownership of OpenAI, with Microsoft having a 49% stake, other investors taking another 49%, and OpenAI's non-profit parent getting 2%. Now, of course, Microsoft has an interest in this because it has a big cloud computing business, Azure. It's the second most popular one after AWS.
Yeah.
So by supporting OpenAI, which is going to be a huge demand point for cloud computing, it's sort of investing in something that's going to use its other services. So it's a virtuous circle for Microsoft. But nonetheless, the structure of the business model suggests to me that this is going to be much harder than appears initially appears to the eye. The structure is complex. And there's a revenue exchange in favor of Microsoft, but whether we can actually reach escape velocity and create a profitable business is yet to be seen. That said, it is gonna, at the moment, post FTX, a lot of these cloud computing companies are I guess, getting hurt by the lack of blockchain businesses coming to them. Like blockchain itself,
Is that actually the case? Like, how I think of crypto as being, in the grand scheme of things, like quite a small industry. Was that actually making them that much money?
So it's not so much crypto itself, it's all the kind of derivatives. Like every single other person was trying to do a blockchain thing, right? So there's the crypto universe, which is still relatively contained, but all those crypto firms, and as you got into the NFTs and all the other kind of
Monopoly
iterations of crypto, AWS was wooing those clients. They were ironically trying to sell their cloud computing services to all the miners. And I mean, that's the irony of it. Like, so it's supposed to be all decentralized, but they were, AWS had a very clear cryptocurrency business and a blockchain business. Yeah. That was seen as like a growth opportunity for AWS and for the other cloud services, right? But because I suspect blockchain is now coming to the point of realization that it's not the end all that it was going to be, that many people thought it was going to be, that's going to cool off. So they're looking for a new type thing to service. And I think ChatGPT is exactly that. So it comes in, it has huge energy and computational needs, and it then powers, the cloud computing services. It makes sense for them to do it. Of course, the fact that Microsoft has to buy the company that it is buying its services from is ironic. Whether that sort of vendor financing loop, has, whether it can break through into its own profit line, I don't know. We'll see. I'm quite skeptical. I think at the moment it's very energy intensive. I don't see the use cases, and I'm worried about how it's going to be deployed in society, because I'm not sure it's good to outsource your brain to an AI in that way.
Well, I mean, the thing I wrote this week, I mean, if you look around, there's loads of instances of it just making it. So, like, there's one guy who looked for scientific studies or papers and something like that, and the bot just made a bunch of them up. So, as in, the titles were fake, the authors were fake, which maybe is more of a human thing to do than an AI thing.
The problem is that it could create this sort of, like ants when they lose the trail, and they end up going in a loop and then killing themselves because they can't get out of their loop. It's called an ant mill, I think. Yeah. That's the risk here, is that we start defaulting, like lazy people who cheat the system anyway, or people who want to plagiarize. It'll make it easier for them. They will default to using ChatGPT to, do their homework, their, academic studies, God knows what. But ChatGPT isn't perfect. It reminds me of like when you look at those AI generated illustrations. Very often they're very impressive, but when you look closely, you notice like the dog noses are all merged, and you realize like the collar is made out of weird, subparts of an animal. Like it's creepy, and it's often weird, and it gets, from far away it looks about right, but when you look closely it's all distorted and basically fucked up. I think ChatGPT is very similar. So it's okay if you're like writing fiction or something where errors are not a problem. But if you start using it to write academic papers,
Yeah.
or if you're using it for journalism, which I think, I saw a tweet the other day, like, what do you do when you've got a journalist who suddenly is filing copy really quickly? It's fairly clean to edit, but then you realize it's ChatGPT. I mean, that is a problem, because when I tried it for doing, just experimenting with it to do a piece about the bioweapon convention, which is very hard to, as a journalist, it's very, all the source material is very fragmented. You really have to search for it.
Yeah.
And I put in a basic set, like, write me a story about how the bioweapons convention works, and it came up with a very authoritative piece, which if you know nothing about the bioweapon convention, you would think, oh yeah, that must be correct, because it not only emulates human prose, but it does it very authoritatively.
Yeah.
But when you look at the details and you go, oh well, it's not 50 members, it's 80 members in reality, you see the problems. It's a really good con man in that sense. And if we normalize that in society, then the risk is that we end up like messing up a whole lot of stuff. Like airplanes will start falling out of the sky because people aren't.
ChatGPT lied about where the airport was. Yeah. No, I think that was basically the exact conclusion I had when looking at it and writing something this week, which is it's really good at a kind of like verbalism. What it reminds me of is, like, if you read an article by a journalist who's writing about something that's kind of complicated, and they say like a legal case. This is when you often notice it, and they don't really understand the legal terms or the nuances of the case, so they'll just regurgitate all of the technical terminology. And when you read it, you go, if you don't understand what that means, that could sound plausible, but actually it doesn't really make that much sense. You've just kind of regurgitated something that sounds like it makes sense, but if you actually know what you're talking about, it doesn't. And so given that that's the case, I just find it, naturally after this happened, there's this huge hype about AI is going to be this amazing industry to invest in, which again, it's plausible that could be the case, but just from limited experience, this kind of doesn't seem like it is. I mean, and especially even if the company was worth, let's say, 29 billion, I mean, like, how much growth is that already factoring in, right? It's kind of crazy. So I just don't really see it as being a viable thing. Yeah.
Not just whether it's viable, it's also if it does become viable, what are the implications? I mean, it would have to be, it would really have to be on another level still to be able to compete with a human in terms of accuracy and all those other factors that we were discussing. So yeah, I'm just worried about the consequences, and what if, ultimately the master AI we've all been fearing is actually quite stupid in many ways, because it's
just like a real human
learning from, like, what is its input? I don't know. Do you know, like, how given we live in this obsessive, like, disinformation, fake news world, like, OpenAI is taking the internet as its feedstock.
Yeah, which is a great source, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and if you end up like saying, well, obviously we can't, like, OpenAI can't, it should be worth putting in, like, what it thinks about conspiracy theories. I don't know whether they segment the input. They might do. They might only teach it from. I don't know. What do you know? I'm not sure what the.
No, I don't know. I don't know how it works, but just
because if it's entirely open-ended, then all the crap on the internet is teaching it as well, and then you get like that Microsoft Tay thing, that bot that ended up becoming a Nazi.
yeah, that was quite funny.
But if you start segmenting it and saying, well, you can only have like the source material from the New York Times or whatever, but then the AI is potentially, biased. So it's not it's worth figuring out, because you're creating an intelligence that is going to be somewhat influenced by its surroundings, and it's the surroundings, going back to WEF, they don't always agree on everything.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we'll see. I think it's one to watch, but I guess my point in the thing I wrote anyway was like there just seems to be we've had this like long period where loads of companies were clearly coming up with stuff that was very subpar and just sort of utopian in what it promised, and like instead of realizing that, even though so many of these companies have just bombed, everyone's immediately jumping on the next hype train. But anyway,
no, I agree. I think you make a good point, and I think this is precisely the next big hope. We have to move on from blockchain, don't we? So this is the new thing.
Yeah, potentially. Okay, well, slightly different topic. So another of the companies which I can never really tell if it should belong in the category of companies I just described, as in promising a lot but not necessarily delivering, is Spotify and perhaps streaming in general. So I've always had some skepticism about Spotify just because they did a direct listing, and when you're not making money, so it's a bit like you've just cashed in and never have to work again, even if everything goes wrong. But to be fair to them, so there was a good piece by David Stevenson, who I think may have worked, maybe a former colleague of yours, kind of. I think he was at the FT, but he writes like a weekly newsletter that's quite good, and he was looking at the figures, and basically there was this fear like everyone's going to cancel their Spotify subscription, and it hasn't, at least yet thus far, right? Doesn't seem like it really happens. They keep increasing. It's like double-digit growth in terms of revenue, and in terms of new subscribers and stuff. So, I mean, I don't know how much you've thought about this as a topic, but do you think that this is like a viable business moving forward, or do you think it's a viable industry, I suppose, the wider streaming industry, or do you think it's one of these things that has kind of popped up as a result of the last 10 years and perhaps isn't viable?
So are they profitable? I'm not familiar enough with their numbers.
So the answer is no, they're not.
They're still not profitable.
Yeah, but they could be one day.
They could be. So, when was their direct listing?
I think it was 2018, but I would. If someone listening may want to double check that, because I'm not entirely sure.
I mean, presumably, if they're not profitable yet, they're going to have to, like, this is going to be the year that a lot of these businesses are going to have to deliver profitability, or else, the cost of capital is just going to become prohibitively expensive. So I think as a business, streaming makes sense to me. The problem is there's so much competition now. Can Spotify maintain, it's definitely like benefiting from first mover advantage, but there's now so much competition in streaming, and Joe Rogan is, I think it must have been over a year ago now, when there was all that controversy about whether I can't remember, some musician was saying he should be kicked off Spotify. Did you remember?
Yeah, that was quite a big thing. But they paid a lot of money to have him. I think they paid
a lot of money, and they didn't kick him off. But if you go now to the Joe Rogan thing, you get all these sort of warnings, like this show is potentially wrong. They've added like all these flags to that's their way of dealing with it. So I guess that's good. I don't know how beyond that, how much censorship they have been doing. It seems to me to be a fairly, I mean, I haven't personally detected any, but maybe that's the way censorship works. I don't know. Maybe you know more than me. If they withstand the pressure to deplatform people, then I think probably they will maintain their edge. The risk is obviously that you get the fragmentation that you've seen in the social media, where people start getting deplatformed and then they go off and start their own rival platforms, and then you get the sort of collapse of the Tower of Babel effect. So I think, I actually don't think that will happen. Like, I think if you look at them, I was thinking about it over the past couple of days, because I think you're an example, right, of I've noticed in the past couple of years there's been this trend of a lot of journalists who work at a big publication and then they will move, because they, for whatever reason, they get tired, they start their own thing, or usually it's moving to Substack.
And if you, I was so just I've been quite interested in Substack and looking at the numbers and how viable it is. Um, and I'm quite skeptical about it just because I think
Oh no, I'm skeptical. That's why I never went on Substack because
yeah, but not because of censorship or something like that. Just because I think that if you look at the newspaper or media business since it started, there's always kind of you've basically always had advertising, and so because Substack is predicated on not really having advertising, I just don't know how viable it is. But the reason I say that, I think that what's interesting potentially about Spotify is that it could become or streaming in general may have to become a bit like cable TV. Like I remember, I never had Sky when I was a kid, and always remember going to people's houses who did have it and thinking it was crazy that you're paying however much you are in a subscription to get a service that you then have to watch adverts on as well. Because I was thinking, the advert should pay for the service you're getting, but obviously they don't. And I think that maybe that a similar thing will happen with Spotify and streaming services more broadly, where you pay this kind of base fee of whatever, 10 quid a month or something like that. But the reality is it just won't cover their costs and they're not going to make money from it. So potentially they already are introducing advertising. And so I wonder if it will become kind of like Sky or something, right? Where you pay this fixed fee per month and then you still have to go through the ads. The only potential problem with that, right, is that if you think about why people paid for premium in the first place, it was so they didn't have to have advertising. So I don't know how much people would accept it. But I think that's kind of where I think it will have to go.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I don't know enough about Spotify's business model to comment, but I know enough about Substack, and I think Substack has exactly that issue. Although if you have a Substack, there's nothing stopping you from advertising on it. You can still put like a banner or do all the kind of sponsored content where you name drop X product in your writing. They don't prevent you from doing that, but Spotify doesn't get a cut of that. It goes straight to the to whoever the creator is, right? So I think Spotify, it's obviously not profitable yet. It's had a huge chunk of investment. But it's burning, I think, through that cash. Now, their main, it's very weighted towards the superstars who make the bulk of the cash. It works for like a handful of very, successful journalists like Matt Taibbi or whoever. They can really make it work. But the average journalist...
You're talking about Substack now, right? Like not you...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
So when you leave and you go to Substack, I think a lot of journalists did. I was very concerned. I saw it as like the Uber equivalent for journalists. So people going, oh yeah, I want the freedom and I can determine when I work, blah, blah, blah. But what they don't realize is that they are losing a hell of a lot of the scaling benefit of being in a news organization. They are not going to have holidays. They're once you get subscribers, you feel like you have to do work all the time. Like they don't, they're paying you monthly. And if you take like a 2-week holiday, it's going to piss them off, right? And if you're a single author, so you're not really accounting for that. You're not accounting for illness. So you don't just have to make your, whatever equivalent that we're making at your newspaper. You have to make more to cover for all those incidentals. So, I think a lot of journalists being kind of ego obsessed didn't necessarily think about that, which is why I never did it, because I wanted to create my intention was always to try and scale things up as quickly as possible, because I knew that without scaling it wouldn't work. Now Substack has since realized this, and now they wouldn't offer me a white label service because that would be optimal for me. But now they are doing that more. So you'll see Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger have now like moved their Substacks to non-Substack URLs. And they're just using the it's like powered by Substack, but it's not. It's its own brand, and it's very much like focused on scaling up. But Substack offers some sort of like Uber started like realizing that, you know, you could collectivize the drivers and offer them better. You could be, you know, peddling sort of insurance to them on preferential terms and stuff like that. So Substack then, like behind the scenes, is selling you like access to, you know, LexisNexis or copyright, you know, approved images like that they have a deal with, right, for their authors, and you benefit from stuff like that a little bit. But it really depends on what deal you have. But even then, I just don't think it's ever going to be as successful as a scaled up news operation, because you have all this fragmentation, and the authors themselves eventually, a lot of the time, it's based around like a specific fad, and they do great for like a year, but then people move on. To have a really, you know, to have that brand differentiation in the long term is very hard if you've started just on a single name basis. But, you know, that's why they were targeting investment writers and financial writers, because that has a history of, like, you know, big names making it viable in the newsletter business. But we will see. I tend to agree with you, though, that it will be a challenge.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Not only do you get thoughts on the markets here, you get insights into the future of the media business as well. So that's probably a good point at which to stop. So Izzy, thanks very much for joining us, and perhaps we'll chat again at some point in the future.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
You've been listening to Trust Issues by Kepler Trust Intelligence. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Remember to visit our website at trustintelligence.co.uk to keep up with all the latest research on investment trusts.